Pooja, do you want to tell us why your thing says that, or do you want to be? It's like midnight or 1 a.m. where she is, so she's probably.
It's a little
Yeah,
self-explanatory, but yeah, it'd be interesting to know
Why you chose
the
that.
ideology behind it, right? Yeah.
I don't know. I just liked it.
Yeah.
I mean,
There you go.
yeah, it's like you just you just have to wander off, and sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
just to gain new perspective and things like that. You
Yeah.
have to go around the world, and that's the goal. And wonder always keep thinking.
Yeah.
Always just think about new ideas and stuff. That's
They
it.
are related ideas, no question about it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
It reminds me of when I was living in Peru. I had just finished my PhD, and that was like grueling. I just like so stressed out from all that. So I wanted to just give myself some time to relax a little bit and just be, I guess. But it was kind of weird because most of the people I would meet, they had their things that they were up to, and I made friends with this Peruvian woman, and ended up staying at her place, boarding up at her house for a month or two. And she's like, "What do you do all day?" It's like, well, I don't know. Sometimes I just walk around and I just go to the shops and practice my Spanish, just start up conversations, and she was fascinated with that. I could just like walk around, just that's it. And we called it, and I said, "You should come with me one day." And we're just going to walk around, she's like, "Oh, okay, I'll go ahead and do it." And what was funny about it was, she was this short Peruvian woman and very quickly realized she couldn't walk as fast as I did. So there was a whole ingredient there where it was just like, oh, we are not going to go like where I would typically go. We're just going to go a little bit closer. But we called it Caminando con Italo. So like, caminando means walking around, and Italo was my name I made for myself for Peruvians to say, because Ethan, saying the th sound in Ethan is not possible. They don't really use that. So Ethan, and so I just turned it into Italo. So we had this joke that I would have like one of these, like one of these reality shows, and it would just be called Caminando con Italo, and just kind of like walking around with Ethan.
Sounds awesome.
Anyways, yeah, it's fun. So yeah, so welcome, and I guess I'll make sure we give the intro to the mastermind here real quick. This is the business podcast Mastermind, started by a few talented friends in the podcasting space, and we eventually grew it to include a wider audience, create a weekly event where we could have some smart people come and talk and some smart people come join us. Right here, my co-host, I have Rob Greenlee. He's the VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn, chair of the Podcast Academy, co-host of the New Media Show, and longtime evangelist of the podcast industry. Henry Lopez is out today, but he's a serial entrepreneur, smart small business coach, and smart business coach, I suppose, and host of the top-rated How of Business podcast, dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small businesses. Vinay is here. He can give a wave, host of the Predictable B2B podcast, founder of Sproutworth. He helps others achieve predictable business growth and influence through content marketing. And I'm Ethan Janney, business and executive coach and co-host of the Run With It podcast, which invites 7+ figure entrepreneurs to share business ideas and the action steps to launch them. So what I thought we'd talk about today is I've been having an interesting experience over the past few years, starting around 2017, in building an audience. Not actually for the podcast that I have right now, because that podcast did not exist back then, but in a different niche. And it has grown into a project that is a entrepreneurial project that I've generated almost $200,000 from over the past few years. And at the same time, I'm having an event right now. I have a convention for within a niche, and that convention is raised over $25,000 in revenue right now. So it's just sort of interesting, maybe case study. We had talked among the host of the show about building influence, and we aim to have a guest on the show that might talk very specifically about building influence. But I think this is also a little bit of a case study for, building an audience within a niche and building reputation. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about that, see if we have any questions that come up. Mark, if you want to take it in any specific direction, we could go there. And then we also have some sort of backup, a few topics we might talk about, just podcasting stuff in general, if there's time. So I'll get started, and just feel free. Anybody can interrupt me at any time or put questions in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on them and make sure I address any points. So to get started, the reason why I think this is helpful for podcasters is because we're trying to build audiences, and we're trying to connect with specific niches, hopefully, of people, because in the end, even if they're not already a niche, they're going to be a niche of people that follows our podcast. And in the end, the idea is to serve people. If you're going to build an audience in any way, usually it's because you're doing something that they find valuable. And so that's what's happened with this particular project of mine over the past several years. And I think it's just useful to look at different stages in the process, different approaches I've taken that worked, different things that didn't work, things that I kind of had to get through to get to where I'm at. So the thing that I think is maybe useful for podcasters to think about is there a niche already? Is there a community already that you can start to think about serving with your podcast? Because I think the idea initially is, I'll start building this audience. People will show up and they'll like my show, and that's why they become the audience. But in the case of this project, we have now what kind of amounts to like a video podcast that happens every week. And to be honest, it's got its own little audience, but that audience sort of comes from another already existing audience. And that makes it a lot easier to, I don't know, think about how to communicate with them and kind of grow your understanding of them. Otherwise, you're kind of starting from scratch. Who is my audience? So when I started the project, so I work with piano technicians for this project. As these kind of nerdy guys who come and tune your pianos, basically. And there's a small percentage of women as well that do it. But for the most part, it's like middle age to late age males that are piano nerds and sort of not technology nerds, but sort of like a technical kind of mechanical nerds. And I was already in the community, but I wasn't necessarily influential in the community. And some of the first things that I started to do was I looked for, there were some Facebook groups online, and there was an organization that had, I could find people that were members of that organization, and even find like a contact list, and reach out to people. At the risk of, luckily, this particular industry, people post their email addresses, because they need to be contacted for services anyways. So it gives a nice excuse to say, oh, I just found you online. I was going to reach out and see, if you're interested in this or that. But knowing that there was an industry organization where all of these people congregated, and they already had relationships with each other, and they already hung out maybe on message boards and had their own little communities that were building, that was useful for me. And I will say this, which I think is also I think it's just useful in general, and different people can apply it how they want to. I didn't really feel like I fit in very well in the beginning into this community. And me coming in, at first I was coming in, the way I approached it was I was soliciting to speak with people, to ask what they needed. It was around starting a business project. So I actually had like probably around 100 different phone calls with people that I set up that were in the industry, just to kind of like have a chat with them and see what their biggest issues were. You know, what are the problems that you're facing in you know, with your career? And I would take notes, and, you know, those conversations would be anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour. And the goal was to, yeah, to find out if I could help you with something, what would it be? And with that particular project, I kind of did some price testing to actually prove whether or not they wanted help with something. Because you can ask someone, oh, hey, I want to help with my bookkeeping. Okay, would you pay $50 for a bookkeeper a month? Well, no, I don't think so, right? So I did some price testing where I was offering a product, and sort of did it like Kickstarter style, where I started with a product, and I said, if I get 10 people to pay XYZ, then we'll do it. If not, I'll return all your money. But you know, I don't think that has to be applied to the situation of the podcaster, but all that is to say that there was sort of a methodology that I used to kind of prove that there was a need for something. And those conversations were really useful in figuring out what was needed. In the end, it turned out people needed education. They needed easier access to education. And so as I think about just this first stage of things, like how could this be applied to building a podcast audience? Number one, find an existing niche, find an existing audience. Where are the people that are already buddies, you know, that talk to each other and they chat about, you know, I think about like Rob's show, right? There's already like media tech nerds that get together and talk about, you know, what's going on in the podcasting industry, right? And who are the people that have the loudest voices, you know, and why, you know, why do people pay attention to them or not pay attention to them? What are they having to say? Things like that. So that's one step I think could be useful in building a podcast audience. And then, you know, the second step, which I think, I don't know that I've heard people doing this with podcasts, but I've noticed that in business building, there's a trend that people tend to not do this, but then when they do this, it works better. And that is sort of this actual person-to-person outreach where you have real conversations. And so in the business building space, they say things like doing things that don't scale, right? So a lot of people talk about having a business that's scalable, but when we try to do things that are like automated, we oftentimes lose touch with actually how they're accomplished. And so it might be interesting to, you know, think about who our potential audiences are, think about those people and see how we could get a chance to actually speak with them, you know, and really get a little bit deeper into how you can solve problems for them and answer questions for them. And instead of creating a product, which is what I did initially, then I would imagine that it would be now become around answering those questions, you know, or leading them to the resources that they need to help them with whatever they're working on, building a business or, you know, podcasting or media related things, whatever it is. You know, this relates to what we heard from Todd Cochran a few weeks ago. It's like the SEO thing, right? What are people searching for online? How can I answer those questions? But just taking it to a personal level, talking to the people that I want to be my audience and finding out what their questions are very directly from them, and then answering them in a podcast. Mm-hmm. And I might even apply it to, like, we haven't really done this exactly with our podcast yet, but even thinking of almost one specific person that almost every episode is for, and that you actually talk to. Because I mean, imagine what it'd be like if you had someone that was doing that for you, you know, every little question that you're working on next, they said, hey, I made a podcast episode about that. You know, you'd be like, oh, okay, cool. I got to go check that out. So that kind of personalized approach to things could be very helpful to making sure at least that you have something that's targeted. And usually when it's targeted to at least one or two or a handful of people, there's some other wider audience could be attracted.
Yeah, I think you also have to think about the level that people are at too, and who you're trying to attract on that too. I think that there's shows that are probably more positioned for beginner level skills, and then others that are more positioned for advanced. I think it's difficult to do both, because when you're talking about advanced concepts, the beginners they're not there yet, right? So you have to balance that. I mean, are you trying to think about that part of it too? People are at different levels of their understanding.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And interestingly enough, with this particular project that I've been working on, I've been gearing towards a more advanced audience.
Right.
And I would say that if maybe it's the grass is greener type of perspective, but I think that the beginner type of audience usually tends to be a wider audience, just because that's the nature of things. People get started on things and then they stop.
Right.
But it also tends to be an audience where you might, I don't know, you might not feel as well, you might not feel the depth, right? You're always going to have to be covering the basics. And so if you want to do that, then that's great. But if you think you might get bored with that or something like that, then you might want to rethink it. But yeah, I think that's a great point. I think you should probably choose one or the other.
Yeah. Well, and I think that a lot of beginners will probably gravitate to the more advanced concepts because they want to be more advanced, right? That's the goal that somebody starting something is they want to do it well. So I think beginners tend to go ahead and subscribe to those podcasts that are more advanced concepts than the ones that are really rudimentary, because then you're kind of limiting the number of people that you might have an interest in that. I think you want to have passionate people about whatever you're talking about too, and those tend to be the more advanced folks.
I would say
yes.
Just on your sort of concept of niching, very in a lot of detail. Which probably most of you have heard, and I was thinking at the time that I wanted to interview lots of variety of different people within businesses. So I didn't think of startups or business owners or CEOs. It was at the start, it was a passion project, and therefore I was looking to interview interesting people. And so I've sort of started broader than you did, Ethan. And ironically, I've had quite a lot of US guests on my podcast, and sometimes my numbers are actually higher in the US than they are even in the UK. And so I'm based in the UK, and I sometimes feel that's a little bit not misjudged, but it's just like it's just been a pattern that I had quite a lot of US guests on a sort of 6-9 month period, and that's sort of stuck. So I started on not the opposite, because it was business and therefore it was quite focused, like it was in a niche. But for keeping my interest up, I wanted to have a variety of different guests on. So I wanted digital marketers, I wanted business owners, I wanted entrepreneurs, I wanted to be people that were just in startups, whatever their type of business was. So I didn't niche very quickly, but it's sort of had sort of consequences. As I was saying, like the US audience is larger than the UK some months. So interesting to think that is business is business a niche enough, or should I go even tighter on, say, startups or small business owners?
I think the one thing that I think is interesting, if you can go there, and again, I'm sort of like making an analogy that may or may not need to be made, is this idea of, is there sort of like a community where people have this sort of almost camaraderie already? They know each other, they've built relationships. A good example of where this did play out in my podcast, we had this thing, we did a recession-proof startup Saturday event back when quarantine just had begun. And we had a guy on the podcast. His name was Anthony Sarandria. And then we said, oh, we're doing this recession-proof startup Saturday. Do you want to participate? He said, yeah, sure. And then he said, you want to have my buddy on? He's also an entrepreneur. you know, and then he said, hey, we got another buddy, maybe he wants to join in on that session. Oh yeah, sure. So then we ended up having a session of this event where it was this Anthony and he had another friend named, I think his name was Anthony as well, Mink. And then he had this guy, Josh Elizechi. They were all these kind of like young entrepreneurs, these kind of guys that are like, they're like 28, but they already have, you know, they've already got a Ferrari, you know what I mean? And it was, you know, they knew each other. And so there was like a camaraderie going on among them. And I think that that just reminds me of what I see sometimes going on in the project that I'm doing on now. It's like, I get to know a guy, and then he's got other friends that he brings into the project and he recommends. And then, you know, like just Saturday, we had a session where, you know, these guys have known each other for, I don't know, like 30 years probably, right? And I'm just having them on the session and they're having a chat. And it's just sort of, I think that what I think is the interesting ingredient there is like a built-in cohesiveness.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things, like besides saying business, but where are there a place where people have like they already have built some sort of cohesiveness among them, and then maybe there's a way to tap into it. Yeah.
And then as kind of a new person to that community, you have to integrate yourself into that and be accepted from that community at the same level too. So from a host perspective, there's some dynamics there too you have to think about too as you integrate yourself into that community, because they kind of have their own, you know, kind of expectation around who's got influence and who doesn't on that side. So
Right. Yeah.
And I've always been open to sort of recommendations from people. I just made a note, maybe I should ask everyone that's a guest on my podcast to recommend one or two people to have on future interviews, because that might be quite interesting. It's like a couple of guys that I've spoken to, they've volunteered people. One was a natural language coach and an NLP, and she's a world renowned, and I've reached out to her and we're gonna have a call in December, and that's just literally just evolved from a conversation I had with someone, got on very, very well with him, and he sort of made sort of suggestions to me. But I wonder building on the niche of business might be interesting, as I said, just to say, well, if you wanted someone, a friend or a colleague or someone you know on the podcast, who would you recommend? That might be an interesting place to go.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah,
and on top of it, just keep an eye out for like more than one, you know, not only where do you end up maybe getting introduced to another person, but then also getting introduced to another community. And maybe another good question to ask, I don't know, I'm just throwing stuff out there, is, are you a part of any groups? Like, do you have any like group of folks that you're always chatting with about stuff, you know? Any particular resources you're always returning to check in on things? Because maybe that also gives an indicator of where you can go.
Yeah, and I know Facebook groups are really developed, and the problem for me on the whole Facebook group thing is that I've probably got like 50 recommendations from people and I've accepted them, and when you start going through your groups, it's not laser focused enough for this exercise, and then you end up with a lot of stuff that isn't adding value at all. So actually but I do think Facebook groups is where, so there's a couple of guys that are in the UK that I follow their work, because they're business people, and they've got quite a developed Facebook group community, like 30, 40, 50,000 worth of active users. And that's been, so one of the other things I do is property, and that's very useful from a property perspective. But as you say, from a business perspective, it might be interesting to see where these people actually, well, if it could be face to face or virtually meet and sort of chew the fat, what we call chew the fat in the UK.
Right. Yeah.
You know, I also think that podcasts that are outside of the U.S. Have a similar but unique challenge too. And you've mentioned it all already. Is you're doing your show from the UK, and you're finding, you know, guests from the US.
Mm.
And are you picking up more audience from the US? If you were to have on guests from the UK, what kind of dynamic does that create? Does
Well,
that create less pickup from the US and
yeah,
only
well,
pick
this
up
is
from the UK?
it's a massive point. And what I've actually what I'm trialing is actually not exclusively UK people, but for the next couple of months, I'm going to try and get a lot more UK focused people to see that exact point. Does that mean there'll be a trail off in the US environment and maybe a pickup in the UK? But does that affect my audience in the US? And I don't have an answer for that. And I think it's actually something I'm trialing at the moment to see if I can pick some UK. Because the thing is, the coaching that I do, the business coaching that I do, could be all aided and supported by the podcast. And I think it does when people are talking to me and as a coach, you can't help but sometimes say, oh, I did a podcast on that exact thing. Like, well, let's talk about it, but why don't you go and listen to the podcast as well? So that always sometimes comes up in conversation. But as so the podcast for me is an enabler for other things, and I'm hoping that, because I've targeted my next so I'm booked up till February or something like that with weekly, sometimes twice weekly podcasts. So I've got a pipeline, but I'm trying to look at a community which are small, business owners in their sort of 20s or 30s, and those people that are going to perhaps have the unicorns, perhaps have the billion-dollar businesses that they've got potential when they've gone through VC funding and seed funding, etc. And I'm trying to target them because I just think it's a slightly different. A lot of the people I've spoken to are established, have a success behind their story, and these guys are going to be relatively famous in the sort of entrepreneurial world. But I thought it might be interesting to have people that are on the journey, not necessarily reached wherever their plateau or whatever they deem success to be.
Yeah,
just to try it, just to try a different audience.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Indie Hackers website? And
no,
that's the same site where our podcast, we've become a part of that Indie Hackers network.
Okay.
And it might be interesting to look. Now it's different. It's actually almost the sort of anti-VC funded startup thing, where it's like, it was actually started by a guy who was in Y Combinator and decided it, he had a business in Y Combinator and it failed really, basically. And he said, hey, wait, why do I have to have a VC funded startup? Why don't I just be an indie hacker, create my own business and create a lifestyle for myself? So there's that audience, but there's people there that are starting things, right? I think that's just either way. And the other thing I noticed, he looks at Hacker News. Do you ever check out Hacker News?
No,
Hacker News is interesting. I haven't looked at it much myself, but it's kind of, it comes out of that Y Combinator, which is sort of like the prototypical, unicorn machine,
startup
or whatever
machine, right?
Yeah. But it's just a message board where, these sort of techie founders or wannabe founders are communicating about business and startups and all that stuff. So that's actually a place where he kind of gathered his first audience, right? And he actually started with, he was one of our previous guests. We got a recording in the member area for that, but he started with an email list and, just launched it. And that's part of where he started to get his following, was from indie hackers. People would come and then they would follow that. So anyways, just thought I'd mention those resources in case there is some overlap.
Yeah, I'll check them out. I'm sort of just at the start of this sort of process, which probably isn't great doing it in December, but just on trying to attract to a slightly different audience. Because it's not that I haven't built an audience, but I always think I need to try and not disrupt, but just sort of change my process slightly and trial something different. I'm very big on my businesses of trialing things to see if they work, and if they work, double down on them. If they don't, maybe you learn from it and then tweak it and change it slightly for something slightly different. So so I'm big on doing those sorts of exercises. So I'm just in that sort of early stage of that sort of plan of having a different type of guest on the podcast.
And another really interesting thing that's coming up for me with what you're saying, and again, it may not be the right direction to go, but if you are having listeners in the US, and in the UK, and that's kind of like there's a mixing and mingling going on there, maybe that's a niche to get into, of this kind of across the pond, like connections across the pond, like entrepreneurs in the US, entrepreneurs in the UK. Yeah. Can you say something, Rob?
Yeah, it's also, I just wonder about the bigger trends of what's happening in podcasting in that regard too, as more listenership accelerates outside of the US. The opportunities for content become more and more global, right? So what does that mean for the content production and how we position the content? Currently, I think that there's many podcasts that are created outside of the US that that more and more are indistinguishable from shows that are created in the US. The typical distinguishing characteristic is usually accent that distinguishes, but I think that's going to become less and less of an issue. So I think it gets back to a content question, right? Of each market could be seen as slightly different, but there are commonalities. And I think it's finding those commonalities of interest that are in the US and in the UK to target shows, and maybe not position your show as from the UK or from the US or whatever. And I'm starting to wonder about that positioning, is that it may, by saying you're one or the other, you're kind of pigeonholing yourself. I don't know what do you think about that, that Mark? I mean, as you think about your marketing your show.
Yeah, I think the organic nature of my podcast, that the US have just progressively increased, and there seems to be a loyal following of people who seem to be downloading quite regularly my new content as well. I actually think the UK and US, from a business point of view, there's a lot of commonalities between right. There's synergy between the two, and therefore it's not, and like I've with the pandemic, I've sort of tried to steer clear of it. Obviously, it's just a massive story for so many people,
right?
And I've had to, well, I've decided that I would pitch in on various points of the sort of pandemic that we're in, but I've always said that this is a UK view. This is my view of it, and it's been specific to UK events rather than US events. But barring that, the interviews that I do, the questions that I ask, it really actually makes very little difference where people are based, because I talk about their journey, I talk about their routes to success, I talk about their life choices to how they got to their realm of success, whatever they think that is, and they are 100% totally universal across many different cultures. I've had a couple of people, even from Singapore, that have reached out to me to have their guests. Now, I've always steered a little bit clear because I'm not great in the morning, so a sort of 6 o'clock in the morning Singapore call doesn't always excite me as much as a 7 o'clock call in the US, like in the UK, in the US time. But it just shows that from a from a business point of view, there is universal themes, and I think that's why I've got the audience in the US, because there are so many universal themes, and I try and keep it. It's not even something I've done consciously, but how I approach an interview and the research that I do on these people, it's irrelevant where they come from, unless there's something. Like I had someone last week, she was that I've just released last week, and she's from Atlanta, and she very much talked about her Atlanta experience, and it was very specific, a lot of the answers she had to Atlanta, which I'm interested to see if that hits a spike or doesn't hit a spike.
Yeah.
But yeah, majority of things are universal across the UK and US.
Yeah, I've always thought that the shows that have strong international listenership, from a content production standpoint, you need to think about this. And I thought about this very early in the early podcasting that I was doing, because I did have a lot of listeners around the world with the early show that I did, was not talking about US things, right? Specifically from the standpoint of whether it be holidays or events or things that are specific to just the US. Because the audience outside of the US, and maybe this is less so in the past, don't necessarily care, but it's an interesting dynamic that I think people outside of the US think more about the US than people in the US think about outside of the US.
Yes.
And though that's not a strong testament to Americans and how open-minded they are, but what it does point to is this dynamic of how you think about how you speak to your audience outside of the US. And I've been a victim of this too when I do the shows that I do about talking about things that are only happening in the US. And I think that alienates your audience outside of the US, because it's just not relevant to them necessarily.
Yeah, and so one of the major influences to me, which is probably cliched as much in the business world, was Tim Ferriss, and sort of his sort of experience inspired me, and therefore some of the inspiration that I had was from US podcasts. It wasn't there's a large proportion of people that I know that only listen to what's called BBC Sounds, and that's a pure BBC podcast and radio.
Well, there's a specific app for that's only available in the UK, right?
Yeah. And I sometimes, when talking to people, I'm like, well, you're kind of limiting yourself quite a lot, because look, I'm British, I'm English, so you won't hear a bad word said against the BBC. But I think if you are trying to think about production to podcasting, I think the US has a lot of really, like the Joe Rogan experience. I'm not the biggest fan of Joe Rogan, but you can't argue that he's had a huge international impact.
Right.
And it's even ironically, I heard, because of Spotify, I heard on a national UK national radio station, Joe Rogan Experience on Spotify, and I was like, that actually took me back a little bit, because it's like, this is a UK national radio that is sucking into the ads for the Joe Rogan show. So I think you're right. I think US podcasts translates more generically to other parts of the world, because people are interested in the US. I was equally surprised when the US have started picking up my podcast and been interested in it, because although they are universal themes and universal questions, I don't know, I was just always a little bit surprised that the audience picked up as it did.
Well, and I think another element that's been going on, and I've been going to panels and going outside of the U.S. myself, is that I think more and more there is a perception that quality podcasts are coming out of Canada and coming out of the UK and coming out of Europe that are maybe could be perceived to be higher quality than what's coming out of the US sometimes. So I think you do have a factor of perception because typically, podcasts are made by the BBC or from CBC, or some of those are terrific productions. People are having amazing experiences with some of those shows, and people in those countries are trying to compete with that, right? So we're seeing a lot of terrific productions coming outside of the US, And you're starting to see in the stats and the numbers in Canada and Australia where the per capita consumption of podcast content is actually higher than in the US. So,
well, interestingly, Australia is a big industry for me as well. And I know it's all English speaking,
right.
And interestingly, Canada, as you said about Canada, a couple of people have reached out to me from Toronto and Vancouver to be on my podcast. So I think there is I was on the podcast movement. You said, Rob, last time that you were on the podcast movement virtual event, and it was really fascinating hearing sometimes just people's perceptions of things like the US only do podcasts and things like that. They were totally the audience of that virtual event was massive and outside of the US, which I thought was really fascinating.
Right, because I'm tending to gravitate to shows. I'm getting this perception that those that have the Australian or English accent, those shows tend to be really high quality productions. So I don't, that's just a bias, but that's something that I'm starting to feel as I'm, I've been in this medium a long time, but there's a quality expectation that's slightly different that's coming from the outside of the U.S. Yeah.
Maybe I should just have a British accent. Maybe it'll improve the quality.
Well, you never know. That's I don't know what it is. It's a psychological thing that's happened just because of the quality of shows that are coming out of those countries.
The funny thing is, though, like you say that, Ethan, like I rarely get it, but I do still get it from time to time. I interview a female from the US and they're like, "Hey, I love your accent, man." I'm like, "Oh."
All of a sudden the accent is an advantage now, right? Yeah. Right.
That's awesome. Are you Mark, are you familiar with this London Reel? I haven't really. Yeah. It's kind of interesting because he's an expat from the US, right?
Yeah.
And he's living in the UK.
Yeah, so he was a New York stockbroker and moved to London, part of that, and sort of had a burnout and decided to go into sort of, it was podcasts, and it's YouTube. He does business programs. He's actually going for London Mayor next year, which I think is quite fascinating. That he's been there for 20. He's been in London for 20 years or something, 15 years, and he at the moment he's second in the running for London Mayor. So whether that sticks, I don't know. But yeah, no, he's done some really interesting conversations with people, and there's a couple of people that have sprung out from him, which I now sort of follow on various guises. But yeah, his production has got really professional in the last.
Right, he definitely does it up on that. Yeah,
like that.
I don't know if it goes anywhere, like I said, but I think that's something that is interesting just to me from a personal standpoint. Is there something there for you? Is there like a US UK kind of connection, like to focus on people who, because I think there are people, actually I may be wrong about this, but I get the sense that there are people who live in the UK who like to follow things in the US because they're in the US, right?
Right.
And
totally.
There's probably some sort of a reverse connection, of people in the US who have some connection with something going on in the UK. And I also think that there's probably some there's a potential for a unique community there, right? Like people who have like a foot in business, and it's UK and US, like this guy, like
Brian Rose.
Brian Rose, right? So it's like, why did he show London Reel? I mean, he doesn't necessarily even have, that's not a theme, but it is, in the subject, like that he's this guy going and living in London. And so there is that potential that there's some sort of community there of like people who are bridging the borders, and when it comes to business, even there's some nuances there that people may be intrigued by, like, oh, what's it like to start a business in UK
what's really
versus the
interesting?
US?
My previous life, before I quit my corporate job, was actually in global mobility. So it was all about moving people around the world in big corporations, and we were doing various sort of solutions to that for tax and various other things. And there always is an expat community from the US, but equally globally as well. Never thought of that as actually a market to actually try and leverage, but it actually makes a lot of sense if there's, as there are, one of the main reasons why people move abroad is because of their jobs and their sort of careers move them there.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, there's less people moving around now.
Well, people are staying put at the moment, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, I had all these plans to go to Europe and Australia and stuff last spring, and I had to cancel them all. So, yeah.
But yeah, no, it's an interesting idea, the whole expat community, both ways, US into the UK and UK into the US. And that's a community I could reach out to relatively quickly and efficiently, because I've got people that I know already. Who are in that community, and as you say, like, think about where they go, what's their community, is an interesting thought.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I remember when we were in, like I was mentioning it briefly earlier, we were living in Peru, right? And it was like, yeah, all of a sudden there was, like, in that town, there were the expats, right? Or like there were the people from the US, or there were people that were, tourist or whatever it was. But there's definitely I became part of a kind of almost like I don't know how you call it. It's like an emergent community, put it that way, that comes out of something that people are doing in common. Yeah. It could be something to check out. So going back to the process of what I've gone through, I think, one of the first steps is finding that niche. And I think beyond that too is finding out who are the people that people listen to already too, right? So if there is I don't know, like in our case, we mentioned Brian Rose. I don't know if it applies to your situation, because he maybe has a slightly different way that he approaches things, but it's like, are there people that people are listening to in this, whatever it is, whatever you choose it to be, expat, community or business community or something like that. And then, again, just to kind of mimic what I found has been really interesting is giving them a place to sound off and to reach out and to, basically say what they have to say, because they're not maybe they're not a podcaster, but they do have their community that they're in touch with. And so when they come up and they say something, people go, oh, look, they're on a podcast now. And kind of check that out and see. And I think that's where that, like you said, asking them who their friends are and having them on with a friend or whatever, it just becomes something everybody's talking about, just like on a small scale it was with those 3 folks that we had in our recession proof startup Saturday. It's like they were all part of now within their little group of people that communicated a lot. Something was happening for that group. So I think that's a key factor. It's like, how can you frame it in such a way so that when you have a person on your podcast or a set of people, there's all of a sudden some buzz in an existing group. Hey, like, this is going on for our group. Look what's happening to our group. Look what's going on for our group. This is interesting. They're going on this podcast, or they're part of this thing.
And for me, LinkedIn and Facebook are probably the sort of social media places because I'm releasing to LinkedIn, and I'm doubling down on a little bit of micro content as well, which I'm releasing on LinkedIn, Instagram, not on Facebook at the moment, but it might be if I can if I can delete basically half or three quarters of that Facebook community and really target maybe expats or startups or entrepreneurs, whatever the sort of, and then I can get to, because equally it's using their language as well is important, and using the common language that if it's expat community, what they are talking about and what the way they talk about different things, I think is key to tap into that community.
And I think there's also a place to, like, yeah, maybe find a few clues about the community online, but then figure out maybe there's an offline community actually that's going on, or maybe it's, yeah. And how can maybe it's about giving a voice to that community too.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to think. And I just say that because, interestingly, about the project I've been going on, I spent a lot of time in the Facebook group initially, and to be honest, it was a good place to kind of get the buzz going. But I actually find that now I don't pay much attention to that Facebook group, because now it's becoming connected with a kind of, I would almost call it like an offline group, right? Or a sort of organic group. So that might be something interesting to look out for as well.
Yeah, I will do.
Plus, it's a lot less annoying to just sift through, 5,000 people, half of them who are just trying to promote their own thing on one of these social media groups. I'm curious, do you guys want to hear a little bit more about this process? Should we go back into some of those other topics that that we were thinking about talking about, Rob? I don't know. Do you have a preference, Mark?
Well, I mean, we've talked about two of them already.
Okay, got
Just
it.
in our natural flow.
Nice.
The other one that I had on my list that we haven't talked about is do we, as a group, do we think that podcasting, as we think about it, as we look forward, is a term that is describing content more than it is how it's distributed? I think up till now, most people have thought that if a podcast isn't included in an RSS feed, it's not a podcast. But I think the industry is starting to challenge that, right? More and more, as we see audio become blended in with a lot of other formats, the fictional productions, reality, true crime kind of stuff, and how some of those things are being put into proprietary listening platforms that are not podcast platforms. And are we coming into a phase where podcasting that term refers to a type of content? And what are the implications of that once we start taking this medium outside of where it started, and that's in an RSS feed?
I think from a podcast point of view, and I've been doing it 3 years.
Right.
I would say that it's not an exclusive, but I think you are missing a trick if you're not now doing a YouTube video of some description with it, because there's leverage there that might not be thought about before. And I also think that now people are using social media so much that these short 2-3 minute clips that you get on social media, I personally think is driving traffic to either YouTube or to your podcast quite powerfully. That seems to be the results that I'm seeing. And therefore it's beyond a pure podcast, because it's like some people that I've spoken to, like, I'd never listen to a podcast, but you show me YouTube and you show me an interview, I'll be there every week. And so I think podcasting still has a huge amount of growth to as a medium, just audio. But I think from my point of view, and I'd be interested to hear, Ethan, or your idea, Rob, that it's gone beyond just an audio medium. You have to align yourself with other mediums as well.
Yeah, I mean, this program is a good example of it, right? As far as I know, Ethan, we're not taking the audio and putting this out in an RSS feed, so right?
No, we're not. Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I actually invited someone to come on, and they were like, well, I'm trying to get podcasters, in a podcast network. I don't go on podcasts. And I was like, well, we don't have a podcast.
Does that help us?
Actually, we have podcasters that maybe want to be part of a network. So maybe that'd be a good person you maybe want to come talk with us. Yeah, right. I think that's one thing that I'm noticing with the things that I'm working on is that it's very useful sometimes to just, for lack of a better term, think outside of the box, right? And just let a thing be what it needs to be, as opposed to saying, I have a podcast. What does that mean? Oh, well, that means I use this service to publish it. It's on iTunes. I'm looking for iTunes ratings, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think more in answer to kind of your query, Rob, about like what's going on with podcasting, it just seems like there's an opportunity now with so many different types of media to sort of build your own media world that samples from whatever mix makes sense, right? You look at somebody like Gary V, right? Who's all about, YouTube's big for him, maybe Facebook, there's certain things that are big for him, but you can't do everything. And I think like, that's why, like, I don't know anything about TikTok, right? But what I do know is there's going to be people who are like TikTok specialists, but then they might use a little bit of Instagram here for this or that. And I think it's really just a matter of not only like figuring out what the good mix is for what you need to present, but willing for it to not look like what somebody else is already doing. If that makes sense.
Gary V's a really good example because Gary V's podcast is actually not very good. Production wise is not very good compared to the YouTube and what he does on social media. It definitely feels like a second thought, the podcast, than like his Facebook and Instagram and details, as well as his YouTube. His YouTube is incredibly developed and incredibly sophisticated, but his podcasts are not where I saw him first, and when trying to listen to it, it's all a little bit patchy, it's a little bit sketchy, it's not quite as well thought out as perhaps the YouTube details. So I think that's quite an interesting contrast, where a lot of people started as podcasters and then branched out to the YouTube and to social media, where he's come from a completely different angle, but feels that podcasting is important, so he puts out content as well, but maybe not as well thought out as the YouTube stuff.
Well, he started out being a video podcaster, is where he started.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So his wine library podcast that he started a long time ago. I met him back in 2008, whatever, back when he was just getting started. But yeah, he started as a video podcaster, and then he didn't embrace audio for a long time. So he's always been pushed on the video side for a long time. And then he got, I think it was just like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, he actually started doing audio.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting example. All right. Well, we're a little bit over time, so we probably should cut off soon. Any final words to wrap up, or should we just hop off? Or?
Yeah. I suppose we can.
No, it's been interesting thinking about the audience, because I like, from my point of view, I'm not looking to have a million downloads or that sort of ambition. For me, it works in parallel with my businesses, and they sort of support each other. And yeah, obviously it'd be nice to have 1 million listens to your podcast, but it's not
also
like...
a burden. It's also a burden to have 1 million downloads. Yeah. It's not as wonderful as everybody thinks it is. So
the more downloads you get, the more death threats you get.
Yeah. Be careful what you wish for is my comment when somebody says that. I want 1 million downloads. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing about having it linked with a business project is you have a measurable thing that you can judge the success of what you're doing by, like, are you making some income from it that doesn't have to be directly correlated with this sort of vanity metrics, which in the end is kind of nice, because then you can be like, oh, I've got 10 downloads, but man, I'm rolling in it,
Right. I made $100 per listener. That's my goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, all right. Well, I hope that was useful for you, Mark. If you have any other questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out, and we'll sign on next week. We'll see you then.
Yeah,
Okay.
brilliant. Thanks a lot, guys.
All
Appreciate
right.
it.
Catch you guys later.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.